Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. This podcast is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox, a new online collection of practical, trusted resources made for those who support global missions from home. Visit us online at globalmissionstoolbox.com to register for access to this growing collection of tools for senders. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode about the crucial role of senders in the Great Commission. If all goes as planned, this episode will be the very first published in 2022. So we wish you all a very happy and blessed year ahead. We're looking forward with anticipation to all our Lord has in store for both goers and senders as we seek to help advance His kingdom. Now, I want you to know that for this introduction today, I am not alone. For some time now, our team has been considering having someone join me in hosting the program, so I'm very pleased to introduce to you today's co-host, Maddie DeSmit. Welcome, Maddie.
Thank you.
Now, this is not Maddie's first time on the podcast. In fact, she shared in a special episode just a few months back in October when she helped introduce the Global Missions Toolbox, which is now very closely related with this program. Maddie serves as the team leader for the Toolbox and has been part of the podcast team behind the scenes, and I'll be very pleased to welcome her point of view sort of more directly on our conversations. Now, Maddie, this doesn't have a lot to do with missions, but we need to get to know you just a little bit. And you had something pretty important take place in your life in the last few weeks, right?
Yes, I did. When we recorded that bonus episode about the launch of the Toolbox, you would have introduced me as Maddie Postma, and that's because I got married in November. So now it's exciting to be introduced as Maddie DeSmit to reflect such a meaningful life event.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such a pleasure to join in this recording, as it was then.
Well, we are very excited to have you share in this way, and very excited for you and Dave, just a great guy, and trust the Lord has great blessings ahead for you too. Now, before we get to our conversation, you've got a word of encouragement for us while we listen, right?
Yes, well, I'm so excited about this interview today. Our guest, as you'll hear more about, is involved in training and equipping senders. And in this episode, she mentions that as individuals are a part of the training that her organization provides, she hopes that everyone will come away doing one thing that they didn't do before when it comes to their role as a sender. And so I would encourage listeners to have that mindset as you listen to this episode as well. What's
really
one role that you can play as a sender that you didn't do before listening to this episode? And there's some really practical suggestions in this interview about what that might look like. So I think we should meet our guest and get into today's episode.
Sounds good. Our guest today is Peggy Spiers, who works on the global support team for All Nations International. She's based in Kansas City, Missouri. Peggy has walked alongside many missionaries as they have prepared to move overseas, and she herself has made many visits to workers around the globe. And as a result of all she's learned, she's helped develop Senders University, or Senders U, which is a customizable training designed to help equip local churches to send and support their own missionaries. I am so looking forward to talking about this. Peggy, welcome to our program.
Thanks so much for having me, Mags. It's great to be here.
Well, we've already found, just before we hit record, that we have a lot in common with Peggy. And for those of you that are regular listeners to this podcast, you're going to hear some familiar themes from a very experienced colleague in missions. Peggy, just before we get to the topic, though, would you take just a minute and share a little bit about your own missions journey?
Sure. So I spent a lifetime as a first grade teacher. It seems like a lifetime ago. And when I left teaching after 30 years, I knew I was going to do something in missions. But after being a perspectives coordinator, I could see the look on people's faces when they realized that they weren't a goer and that they hadn't been called to go. And I thought, you know what? We need to have a training for senders. And so that's how Senders U was born, and God launched me into working with adults rather than children.
Well, there's another mention of perspectives, and here's where I'll say right at the beginning, we take show notes during these programs. If you're not familiar with it, that'll be found on the website at globalmissionspodcast.com. And any resources or ideas that are mentioned, we keep in that simple list there. So perspectives is one of them. We've actually done interviews with those who are leading perspectives. It is a wonderful training program that you can consider either as an individual or as a church or as a city. If you went together with other churches, I won't talk too much more about that. This is going to be about the senders here, but you can find all that in the show notes. Now, Peggy, turning towards Senders U right away, tell us a little bit about this. Maybe start with the website and then let's unpack what is Senders U.
Yeah, so you can read a little bit more about it on our website, allnations.international. So, as a perspectives coordinator, when I saw this look come over people's faces, sometimes I think it was guilt. Sometimes maybe they felt like God had overlooked them, or that they weren't qualified somehow to be a missionary. And I thought, oh, that's so sad. And so I began to research, and this was probably close to 10 years ago. I began to research that region of the country where I was living to see where senders would go to get trained. And we couldn't find any place. And I thought, here are people who have a love for missions, and they have no clue right now as to how to get involved unless they become a missionary. And I thought too think of the missions committee members. They love Jesus, they love the nations. How did they get trained to do what they do? It seems like there should be something available for them. And so I began to put some things together. And as I was walking with folks, preparing them to go and learning about their missions agencies and what they were going to need, then Senders U was born. And when I started working at All Nations International, it was my platform to launch it. And it's a great next step to maybe perspectives or maybe something for a church to host as they want to equip their missions committee. And if they're getting sending teams or advocacy teams or Barnabas teams, whatever you call them, getting them together is a great time to host a Senders U. It's very practical, very interactive.
Well, let me dig just a little deeper and ask what it looks like. Some of us know perspectives. It's taught over 13 to 15 weeks, typically with one night a week. And, there are instructors. What does Senders U look like? How is it delivered?
We like to come into a church or a local community and spend about 7 hours together. It works good to do it on a Friday night and Saturday morning, so there's a little break. Everyone gets a little weary. And we find out that a lot of times the good ideas and the good interaction actually happens over the coffee pot, or over the snack table, where people are just brainstorming or they're asking questions of each other. And it's great when a community actually host Senders U, because then there are many churches in the room and they can talk about what's been successful, what their challenges are, and then people can come up and ask us specific questions. And we don't claim to be like the official word on senders by far, but we can just share our stories that we've heard from missionaries on the field and other sending churches' experience. So it's a great time for brainstorming, for us to pass on some logistics or statistics that may be helpful that maybe the local church doesn't know. And we want everyone to leave doing something they didn't do before in the sending category.
Mm-hmm. That's a great challenge. Well, this is really helpful to get an idea about the particular program there. We want to unpack some of the ideas around it. When we talk as Christians about missions, Peggy, very often we are emphasizing, or the conversation goes toward goers. So our listeners understand goers are the mission workers themselves, sent to go from their home place to another place, often near or far. But why do you think we need to lift our emphasis on senders?
Yeah, well, when the scriptures in Romans 10, it talks about how shall they go unless they're sent? So I think there's a responsibility there. And I think the other thing is, when I read the Great Commission, Jesus uses the word go, when we're to be making disciples. It's an as you go thing. So we're all going. We're not disobedient when we don't become a missionary. But then what is our role? Well, if somebody is actually using their passport and moving to another place, then there's basically a supply chain behind them. There are responsibilities for people and roles for people behind them to do. So I think it is our biblical mandate to go, but we go differently, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. Now, when we think of, I've just identified with what you've said already, in speaking to a church very often, many people there realize, at least for the time being, that they're not going to be goers. God hasn't called me to Africa. And as a result, they would almost politely tune to another channel while the rest of you talk about missions, because I'm not going to be a goer. This idea of lifting senders has really engaged many more people, the rest, I could say, those who are not goers, in a really helpful way. I know you use a main analogy to help describe this. Tell us a little about that, please.
This is helpful because anybody can understand this, and it's even great to use with children. So if you're familiar with when William Carey got ready to go to India, he used the analogy of going down into like a gold mine. And so he was saying that there was gold basically to be mined in India. And so he said to his senders, I will go down, but remember, you must hold the rope. So we asked a good friend of ours who's a rock climber and very familiar with ropes and these kind of descents. And we said, Tom, if you were doing this kind of descent, into a mine, how many people would you want holding your rope? And he said, I would want 10 men my size holding the rope. And so I thought, wow, to think about that people get weary. Things happen, different life events happen. But if your life was dependent on it, you would want 10 people. You would want good people at the top, basically holding your rope, because your life is in their hands. And so I think it's good when the church realizes that this isn't just a busy work kind of role, that you have a very, very important job to make this mission successful.
That's a great word. To those who will not be goers, you have an honored and important role right from the scriptures, and very practical in these days. So let's turn to some of the specific ideas, Peggy. What are some of the specific ways that senders can send?
I love this. When our church planters get trained, they learn, as Paul told Timothy, be hospitable. They said this is one of the greatest characteristics that a church planter can use on the field. Be welcoming. If senders were also welcoming, if they opened their home, maybe they have extra space to house a missionary or to host like perspectives instructors or a prayer group, that would be great. And maybe they don't do missions, quote unquote, but they have the space. They have a lovely backyard or a back porch. But then they say, well, you know what? I don't really cook. Oh, but that's where the chocolate chip cookie baker becomes the hero, because someone just does. They do this well and everyone knows. So you can even advertise and say, Mrs. Smith is making her chocolate chip cookies, so please come. And it's a way to invite people into a role that's really needed. And it's scriptural. We're supposed to be hospitable, even if somebody doesn't feel like they have the gift of hospitality, if you know what I mean. So we don't usually think of that when we think about sending missionaries as being hospitable and offering up your your special chocolate chip cookies, but it's really important.
I love the idea of making it accessible to people, not overwhelming, but bringing your gift to contribute to it. I think of hospitality by senders for mission workers, for the goers. And something just came to mind. Just a shout out to those of you that are generous. If you've got a vacation place, some folks up here in Canada, they'll have a cottage and they'll make that available to a missionary family that's on furlough. I know I'm going off a little bit on the side of hospitality there, but just bringing what you have. Sometimes it'll be chocolate chip cookies or it might be your cottage. Some real practical ideas. Keep us going there. What are some other examples that come to mind when you think of blessing as a sender?
Well, these also are kind of unusual, but there are people who just kind of keep an eye on the news. So imagine somebody was going, we'll just say they're going to Nigeria. if somebody on a sending team or on a missions committee would say, you know what, I'm just going to keep an eye on the news for that region. So they pay attention to what's happening with the weather, they pay attention to what's happening in politics, and then they can get word to like a prayer team. And it doesn't seem very important, maybe at first, but boy, if a missionary were to get a note from somebody in their church saying, boy, I've heard there's been a drought. How are you all doing? Or I know the elections are coming up next week. Just want you to know that we're thinking of you and remembering you at this time. Wow, what a specific way to show that you care. And along with that, if there was somebody who was a calendar keeper, and usually we think of remembering missionaries' birthdays and anniversaries, but how about remembering the day when they're going to take their final exam for their language test? Or how about keeping an eye on when they have to do their next visa run? Those kind of things are really important, and they actually take up a lot of time in a missionary's life. And if you were to acknowledge those to them and say, by the way, I know you have to do your visa run next week. Where are you going, and how are you doing? And do you have enough funds to make this trip? And we'll be praying for you. Wow,
Mm-hmm.
really practical ways to be a
Mm-hmm.
part of a sending team.
It honors people, doesn't it? When there's some specificity to it, there's some awareness. It is possible, and it's an encouragement when you just write and say, "Well, we're praying for you." That is an encouragement. We wouldn't want to say, "Please don't do that." But if it is informed to that more personal level, that just adds a layer of love and care that, like you said, the final tests or visa runs, something like that. It does take the intentional care of someone in the church to take initiative around this, right, Peggy?
Right. Right. And so I think initiative is a hard thing. We want to be invited many times, but I think if we're willing to go first, and actually, if I could just take a little rabbit trail here, one time I was kind of venting, I think, to God and telling him that it's tiring and it feels kind of risky to make these initiatives and to initiate in these situations. And he reminded me that he initiated with me. And that's why we love him, because he loved us first. And so I think that's another characteristic of God, to go first. I think it takes some of the pressure, I think, off of a missionary or a goer by initiating and making an invitation and offering and asking a question. It is risky, but I think it's worth doing.
That's really good. Well, we use this term missions committee, and we use it because it's very general, and you may call it something different in your church, a Go team, the Barnabas team. But with that group in mind, Peggy, those sometimes volunteers who really want to do a good job of this, how can that group invite the larger congregation to participate in this? What are some of the ideas around that?
I think one of the things that's really important is to make the invitations very personal. Don't use email or the bulletin to make these invitations. Back to the chocolate chip cookie baker. Go up to them on a Sunday morning and invite them. Say, this group is going to be meeting to pray for these missionary families. Would you come and bring your chocolate chip cookies? Because then the people will really feel welcome. But I think it's inviting people for where they are. And if we cannot use the word missions, and that's not to do a bait and switch at all, but it's to try to re-educate people as to what this missions is. I met a woman recently who has some missionaries in a secure location. They can't advertise from the platform or on the church website and things like that. But she really wanted to bring awareness to her church about these missionaries. And so she actually made a sandwich board. And on Sunday mornings, she came into the foyer of the church wearing this sandwich board. And we said, wouldn't it be great if you invited the kids to walk beside you with a bicycle horn or a bell of some sort? And what a way to invite kids into being a part of missions. So just little things like that for all of our different situations. What are the needs and how can they be met? In maybe some unusual ways to get more people involved. There are people that have skills like graphic design that could be very used. Just IT work in general is so useful. But instead of inviting them to the missions committee or a missions meeting, then say, you know what, would you meet with this group and teach them how to use Zoom? They really want to be involved, but they don't know how to do it. Would you download it for them and give them some instruction? And they don't know they're a part of the missions, the mission sending team at that moment, but they're using their gifts. But we need to know people well enough to invite them. We know how we feel when we're invited to bring what we're good at or what we're known for. So I think that's a way to honor others, is to invite them in a way that they're comfortable with and they're familiar with.
Yeah. It's a little bit of saying, look down and see what you have in your hand. Don't need to necessarily stretch. Maybe God will stretch us. That's okay too. But sometimes he'll ask us to use what we're good at, what we like doing, baking cookies, doing graphic design. I love just the breadth of ideas that you're presenting, Peggy. I wonder if you have any more ideas just where you've seen this done really well. Maybe it's a little bit off the beaten path. It's not your typical missions committee encouragement or congregational participation as senders. Where have you seen it being done really well?
We have another church who also could not get platform time to talk about their missionaries. So someone came up with the idea of making baseball cards, basically, for each of their missionaries. And they put some statistics, maybe their birthday or their favorite color or a hobby or a nickname or something on this baseball card. And then on a Sunday morning during the meet and greet time, they would exchange baseball cards. And then all the week while you had that baseball card, you would pray for your missionary. And then next Sunday, you'd come and you'd pull out your card. And when everyone was standing up and greeting one another, they'd change cards. And I thought, what a great idea. There's no security breached. It doesn't take up any platform time. And people are actually holding these cards with these pictures or maybe a map or something on it to get to know these people. I thought, wow, that is really personal and it's a great idea.
Yes, it's really good. I really appreciate, Peggy, how you are acknowledging a challenge that some missions committees face, maybe many even, that there isn't necessarily regular time on the platform at a lectern with a microphone to talk about global missions. But there are lots of ways, if we're creative, that we can go around that and still really welcome people into participating.
Yeah, and in these days too of security, that's a real thing. Even if we did have time, we do have to do it differently. And so I think that forces our hand on one side, but I think it's also good to create something new, to get more people involved too, to make it happen.
Yeah. In these days, even in these pandemic days, when we have many limitations and many services are online, that means they're being broadcast. That means they're often being recorded. And we've got to be really careful when we have workers in creative access places. Such good ideas here. We are going to continue with Peggy in just a minute. We'd like to ask her to share particularly about resources and some essential ideas for senders to help fulfill their role. Just before we get to that part of the conversation, we'd like to share with you this mission resource that we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
God has chosen local churches just like yours to fulfill His mission around the world. As your partner, Send comes alongside your church to help care for missionaries, develop a sending culture, provide global opportunities to serve, and equip your members for cross-cultural ministry. Learn more and connect with Send at send.org/church. And now, back to today's conversation.
Well, we're back with Peggy Spiers from All Nations International. And just before we get to 4 key ideas, creative ideas that I've asked Peggy for, I'll just mention there are a number of other episodes on this podcast that relate to this topic. Ingredients of a Healthy Sending Church by Pastor Steve Byrne. 3 Principles for Growing a Healthy Sending Church. Pastor Brad Bell helped us with that one. We will include those episodes in the show notes. So if you would like to strengthen your church and your committee to be better at sending, check out the show notes for this episode and you'll find a bunch of other opportunities to learn about that. Peggy, we'd like you to share some starter ideas now to help senders fulfill their role really well. What's the first creative idea you'd suggest?
I'm not sure that this is a creative idea, but I think just coming in as a learner. I have a friend who says we don't know what we don't know. And so there are a lot of places to start with that. Maybe reading a journal like Mission Frontiers or downloading the Joshua Project app on your phone and just praying for an unreached people group every day or something like that, to just be a learner. If you don't get missionary newsletters, ask around and see whose missionary newsletters you could sign up for and just read them to learn about what they're doing.
I appreciate you lifting the idea of learning. I also want to add in, learn at a pace that you can manage, because it can be overwhelming once it starts to. And so I encourage people, do you have a personal relationship with any of the goers from your church that you knew before they went or they are preparing to go? And keep the number manageable as well. Love the idea. Just be a learner. Okay, great suggestion. What's the next one you have for us, Peggy?
The next one seems kind of obvious, but actually it's not. Reply to the newsletters you read. So I agree with you. Keep it manageable. So, but I just said this at a Senders U a couple weeks ago, and one woman in the room said, "It never occurred to me to reply." Now, I've taken a not very scientific poll of how many replies people get back, but just on average, it's less than 4% of the newsletters that are sent. And, actually, our missionaries really don't like to write newsletters. And I think that's actually one of the reasons, is because they don't hear back. And it's not like reading a newspaper. It is meant to be interactive. I suggest commenting on a picture and using the language your missionary uses. We don't ever use the word missionary, but we're so excited about the work you do. We remember you often. I love that picture. The kids are growing. Is that your neighbor next to you in the picture? Is that the shop on your street? Something very personal. And you might even say to them, I read it to the end.
I have my next blog post here now, because I'm going to write about some ideas to just reply to missionary updates or newsletters.
Yes. And you know what? Sometimes missionaries actually need a little coaching in how to write a newsletter.
That's a good word.
And so sometimes actually they're kind of long or tedious or something. And so you might say, I just have a suggestion. I think I'll get more people to respond to your newsletters for you if you'll just shorten them up a little bit or put more white space or more pictures or something.
Mm-hmm. Well, here's a shout out to someone who serves actually on our board of directors. His name is Richard. And Richard makes it a point of replying to every missionary update that he receives. It's not complex. He'll read through it, pray over it, and send sometimes just a one-line reply back. But that has made such an impression on our workers. You can be a great encouragement just by writing a simple reply. So we've talked about being a learner. We've talked about replying to newsletters or updates. What's the third suggestion you have for us?
This one it comes in the learner category, but it's, get to know the agencies that your missionaries are sent with, because they go with all sorts of agencies that have all sorts of work. So get to know them, and don't just get to know the work that the agency does, but get to know some of the people in the agency. So you can actually call them, ask them if you could come visit, ask if you could sit in on a day of their training, really get to know them. And if the agency has pastoral care workers, you really want to get to know them, because they're people that are working alongside you to care for your people.
Great suggestion. And just a suggestion for those of you listening who might be serving in an agency. Can you help those sending churches know who they can talk to in your organization? And if you're in that member care or pastoral care role, could you make sure that your contact information is bright for the sending church so they know who to call? And it's not just kind of getting to the front desk and trying to sort through who do I talk to if we have a concern about the missionary that we love, but they know who to call and who to talk to about that. So this is a little bit on the agency as well, I think, Peggy, to make sure that that information is super clear and available to the sending churches. We do want to encourage that relationship too, not just with the missionary, but with the agency, because if that's familiar, if that's a trusting relationship, that facilitates all kinds of good fruit. Should emergencies arise, we really can be well prepared, better prepared by building a trusting relationship in advance. There is one episode that I'll mention really quick. It's number 107, How Sending Churches and Mission Agencies Can Work Well Together. Whole episode on this topic. You might want to check that out. Peggy, I know we're on the same wavelength there. Let's go ahead to number 4. What do you suggest?
Well, we mentioned something about security. And in our agency, we have actually a security team, and they keep abreast of technical things. And one of them is the apps we use to communicate. So right now, the most secure app that we know of for regular texting sorts of things is Signal. And you know what? That may change tomorrow. But I think as senders, just like goers have to adapt all the time. All the time, the rules are changing for them. So for us as senders, we need to kind of own that too and say, we know this is going to change. And so I may have to change what platforms I use for communicating, what apps I use, and be ready to do it and willing to do it. And that goes back to being a learner and also finding somebody in the church who can really help with that. Because you know what? Sometimes it might be a 15-year-old in our church that really is the best one to get people set up in this. And that's great. What a great way to get them involved. And also, it's no shame to us if we don't know how these new apps or different softwares or whatever you work. But just be ready and then practice them. Don't be afraid of them. We are concerned about security, but my friend Ken and I have a common friends and they work in the secure area. And so I saw him one day and I said, Ken, have you been in touch with our friends? Oh, no. I'd be afraid I'd say the wrong thing. So I said, smile. And he was at work. I quickly took his picture and sent it to them. Within 10 seconds, they wrote back and said, tell Ken we said hi. And he just looked at me. Really? It's that simple? I said, yes, it's that simple. So
Great
keep in touch with our
example.
folks, but make sure you're careful with your language, but just tell them how your tomatoes are doing, that there's a cold front coming in. Tell them how the high school football team is doing, that the hockey team has been practicing, just normal stuff.
That was such a nice switch, cross-cultural, that you would mention hockey for our Canadian listeners.
Yes.
Way to go. The idea is so solid. Communicate and find the right way to communicate. As we record this, it's November of 2021, and Signal is considered secure. That does change from time to time with all the challenges and communications in the world. So if you're listening to this sometime in the future, just make sure that you're a bit up to date on that. And hopefully, I'll go back to the mission agency. If you have a question about this, reach out to the mission agency because we can help describe what would be appropriate to reach out to any particular worker. Peggy, we appreciate these ideas. I wonder if you have particular resources that you would recommend for senders.
Yeah, Max, thanks for asking. I have several, and I think it depends on where the sender is. If the sender is just getting started, I recommend something like Foreign to Familiar by Sarah Lanier. It's such an easy read and so practical. And for those that don't have too much cross-cultural experience, they'll say, oh, I didn't even know. I didn't even know cultures were so different, that responded so different. So it's a great learning tool. And you might look at some of Dwayne Elmer's books. His books, Cross-Cultural Servanthood, for example, Cross-Cultural Communication is another one. They're just really helpful for understanding how different cultures think. And I think that's helpful as we support our missionaries, knowing that they're in a different culture. And Dwayne Elmer makes the comment that if you're married, you're in a cross-cultural relationship. So you don't have to go far to be in a cross-cultural relationship. Another one that's a new favorite of mine is called Raising Up a Generation of Healthy Third Culture Kids by Lauren Wells. And this is full of practical ideas, and it really gives us insight to what some of our families are going through. And I think that's really important to serve them well. There's a really practical book called Praying for Your Missionary by Eddie Bune. It's also very, very practical. And another one is called How to Bless a Missionary by Jennifer Brannon.
Wow, great list. We did do an interview with Pastor Eddie, by the way, after his book came out, Praying for Your Missionary, and we'll include all of those resources in the show notes. Well, Peggy, this has been fantastic, creative ideas, and we have just scratched the surface of this topic. I've got one more question for you, content related, but if anyone would like to reach out to you, would like to learn more, how could they do that?
2 ways. One way is you could contact me directly, and my email is pspiers@allnations.international. And I don't have an assistant, but I do try to answer pretty promptly. And the other way is you can just contact us at info@allnations.international for maybe more general questions.
Sounds good. And you will find Peggy's email address in the show notes as well. So you can find it there if you didn't get it jotted down in time. Well, as we close, Peggy, I'd like to ask you this final question. It's a favorite on this broadcast or on our program. If you had the opportunity to stand in front of a group of people serving on missions committees and pastors, these are the folks in our churches who would really like to do a good job of missions. And you're wanting to encourage them, of course, as senders. You have an opportunity to say to them, what would you like to say?
Wow. I can get emotional just picturing this scene. First of all, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for all your unseen work, for the hours that you've already put in, for the time you've spent communicating with your workers. Yeah, for even signing up for newsletters and listening to podcasts and just trying to do your best. You have loved so well. Yeah, that's the heart of Jesus. And I also want to say that, there are other resources that are right there in your church, and be encouraged. Ask God for creativity to find them. And I think it's John Stott who said, if we're supposed to be the whole church taking the whole gospel to the whole world. And there's so many people in the church that feel like they haven't been invited. And so we're going to have to be creative to figure out how to invite them, to make space for them. But there is a space for them. I can guarantee it.
Well, it's a beautiful word to conclude on. Peggy, thank you so much for spending this time with us, being an encouragement to our team and to our audience today. We appreciate you being part of the Global Missions Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, what a great episode. Mags, thanks for hosting that interview and introducing us to the guest today. I'd like to know, and I'm sure our audience would as well, what stood out to you from that interview?
Well, I loved how practical it was. The ideas were, you could take it away and begin to apply it right away. My specific highlight will be, which app will you use to reach out to your missionary family that you know and love? Signal was mentioned. WhatsApp sometimes will work, or email or text. What is the best method to let your missionary know that you're paying attention and that you care? Get that app and get using it. That's my takeaway.
Yeah, that's a great one.
How about you?
I would say such a practical takeaway I found was her suggestion to be paying attention to the news and just what is going on in the particular area that a mission worker serves. Such a good way to just be aware of how you can be praying and encouraging mission workers that you know.
Well, there were lots of practical ideas there. This episode was brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox, an online collection of resources especially for senders, pastors, missions committees, and family and friends of workers sent to serve in missions. Remember, you can find the show notes at globalmissionspodcast.com. Well, now it's Maddie and I inviting you together to join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.